So welcome to the City Hall Fellows Kickstart Your Local Government Career webinar. This is the second time City Hall Fellows has hosted a webinar like this. So we hope you all find it helpful, and feel free to enter any questions you have along the way in the chat, or even, we have our small enough group here. If you even have questions, feel free to raise your hand and I can try to address them. A few housekeeping items. I believe, Michael, you might be able to help me with this. I think all attendees should be muted just to avoid some background noise. So please go ahead and mute yourself if for whatever reason you're not muted. Audience, as I said, audience questions are encouraged, and feel free to use the chat function. We'll revisit Q&A before the end of the hour. I believe in the Google Doc where you RSVP, there may have been a field where you've entered in questions, and so we'll try to address those as well. As you may have heard when you joined, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll have these slides and this recording available in case you want to revisit, or there are colleagues or friends that couldn't join. And then the last thing is just a caveat. It's all of the information that I'm going to share with you today is really based off of, personal advice and opinions of those who are joining us. So Michael may have his opinions as well. I've, for example, applied to many jobs with the city and have kind of discovered that it's a bit of an art and a science. And so a lot of what we're going to share today has to do with our own personal experience. And in no ways do we represent the Department of Human Resources or any HR department or HR analyst. So just a caveat for the group. To give you a little bit of update on our background, on City Hall Fellows and which organization is hosting this webinar for you. City Hall Fellows is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a professional network that our mission is to attract, grow, and retain a new generation of workforce that believes in local government. And then we believe it's the most rewarding place to grow your career and positively impact communities. So that's, we're here to really encourage folks to consider local government as the best place to grow your career. And if you're already working in local government, figure out ways to make sure we retain talent with cities and counties. And we really feel like it's where the rubber meets the road in terms of most valuable impact to the community. An introduction to who's on the webinar here. So my name is Jamie Karubin. I serve as the treasurer for the City Hall Fellows Board, and my background is primarily in public and development finance. Aside from being the treasurer of the City Hall Fellows Board, my day job is with the City and County of San Francisco. I'm a finance manager with a department called the Treasure Island Development Authority, or TIDA, and we oversee the development that's going on at Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island, which is right in the middle of the bay. And it's a really exciting new development project that's going to bring 8,000 units of housing, almost 30% of which will be affordable permanently, and new transportation infrastructure, new roads and utilities. And so it's really like building a mini city right smack down in the middle of the bay. So I have some knowledge around development finance, but I'll be leading the bulk of the webinar, but I also have my colleague here, Michael, who can introduce himself.
Yes, so I'm Michael Cox. I am the events chair for the City Hall Fellows Board. And in my day job, I work at SF Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART, in their sustainability department. I do data analysis, helping track the district's greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, water use, waste production, and implementing some of the action items that were identified in BART's Sustainability Action Plan.
Great, thanks, Michael. And for the other board members who unfortunately couldn't join us this evening, we're a working board of about 10 members, and we're made up of mostly folks who work in local government. A few had worked in local government and currently work in the private sector or the nonprofit sector, which we'll talk a little bit about later. They represent folks who work in performance planning, economic development planning, transportation, as we discussed, and sustainability. Really a whole menu of interests that our board members happen to work on their day jobs. And so please feel free to use us as a resource going forward. We host events like this, but we also, in our day jobs, many of us work for local jurisdictions. So feel free to tune in and reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions. The agenda for today's webinar is really the bulk of the conversation will be under topic 1. And this is sort of the nuts and bolts of applying and interviewing for a city job. Being based in San Francisco, we're using the San Francisco application portal and process as a template for discussion, just given our experience. But it's really applicable, I think, to many local jurisdictions as well. We're going to talk about applying and interviewing for local jurisdictions, as well as other job searching resources as you look to kickstart your career in local government. And then we'll finish off the webinar with talking about topic 2 and 3, which is to prepare yourself for grad school, if that's something that you're interested in, or other post-grad programs. A lot of folks who work in local government often take a leave of absence, if you will, to pursue graduate degrees. And so there's various programs that folks could consider. And then even if you're not in local government, which many people through their career paths find themselves, in other sectors, there's still a lot of opportunity to work with and alongside local governments. And so that's, primarily in the nonprofit and the private sector. And so we can give you some anecdotal examples of how you can work in those sectors, but still sort of connect what you're doing on a day-to-day with the values of local government. As I mentioned, we're using the City and County of San Francisco as a example of how to kind of approach and attack applying for local government jobs. You'll see here that we have listed many cities and counties like San Francisco will have a Department of Human Resources website that will likely will be the portal for how you apply to city jobs. For San Francisco, it's sfdhr.org. And my first recommendation would be to visit these websites, sfdhr.org being an example, and set up your email to notify you when certain job announcements or postings become available. And in San Francisco, that's done based off of something called a classification. And so I think I can switch over. Let me see if I can switch over to the other screen. Can you see that screen that I switched over to?
No, we're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Let me stop share and reshare. That work?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. I'm a Teams person, not a Zoom person. So actually, if you go to sfgov.org and you click, I jumped there a bit. If you click job seekers, and there's usually at any website a field up above, but if we're looking specifically to apply to jobs, I would go to job opportunities. And the lovely thing about San Francisco, and I'm hoping other cities take this into account as well, is they just recently, within the last 2 weeks, upgraded their I think back-end interface to make it easier for people to apply to jobs. So some of the screenshots I'll share today are from the old system, but the information will transfer to this as well. But it's really great to have something more comprehensive. So you'll see that a lot of the jobs are organized by department, and then there's these numbers, to the side of the postings, and these are what I was referencing as classifications. And so for me, the easiest way to approach the job hunting sort of process is to filter which classifications are most applicable to you, and that's largely based off of work experience and level of education. So if you're, for example, if you're a fairly recent in your career, and you or might be a few years out of college, I would recommend looking at the 1820 series in San Francisco, which I'm just going to click this here, see where it takes us. Oh, interesting. Yeah, so this is the new interface, which is really great. The 1823 18 series consists of 1820s, 1822s, 1823s, and then the higher ranking analyst levels are the 1824s and 1825s. You can search back at the main website where's my classification database? Let's see. Oh, I don't know if I see it here. You can search through these based off of classification, what job openings would be most applicable to you. There you go. And you can look at that using something called a classification and compensation database. And let's just, for example, search 1822s here. In 1822, you'll take this link, and what you could do is you can click through the database and find out what are the requirements of this specific classification. And so you'll see here down below, it's based off of degree of education. So whether you have a bachelor's or a master's, and then how many years of full-time experience do you have? And so what I've done early in my career is I figured out, like, okay, maybe I'm eligible for an 1822, but if I really only have 2 years of full-time experience, that's probably my limit. And I'm going to be only looking really at 1822 positions. I might look at 1823 positions, which may require more than a couple of years of experience. And that's kind of how I would filter my search. And then there's a mechanism on many of these sites where you can set a notification email, notify me when jobs open for this 1822 position, for example. And so rather than having to scour through these websites every so often, if you set your filter so that your personal account doesn't filter out spam from an @gov email address, you should be able to just get notified. So that's the best way to kind of set the starting point off of how you would approach this process, so that way you're getting a steady pool of opportunities that just get emailed to you. If I go back to my presentation, oops, let's go here. So as I mentioned, the way that you would filter out classifications is based off of what minimum qualifications are in work experience. And we'll talk a little bit about that. You set your email notifications, so that'll let you know when these postings become available. And then a really great rule of thumb, it might sound insane for some people, is to allow yourself about 3 to 6 months for a full application cycle to begin and conclude. There are some exceptions where it can be faster than that, but in my experience, if you're really trying to plan ahead, allow yourself a good amount of buffer time. I say this for folks who are maybe in internship programs like the SFL's program, where you know that there is a sunset to when your program will end. You always want to anticipate before that end point how long it's going to take you to secure a permanent position, or sorry, a position with the city if you do want to continue working for a city department. And so it's always good to start early, but really give yourself some time. Kind of going to the whole point about work experience and training. There's this concept in the civil service world, and very much for San Francisco, of minimum qualifications. And a lot of people will say, well, do you meet the MQs? And what they mean when they say that are minimum qualifications. And that's primarily based off of two things. It's based off, as I mentioned, your education level and your qualifying experience in education. So again, looking at this 1822 administrative analyst classification, this first portion up above is describing, to what degree do you meet the requirements from an education level. So for the most part, if you have a master's degree, you're almost always going to be eligible for a good number of analyst positions. And that's just because they see a master's degree as a good thing, and that makes you more qualified and eligible for these positions. But let's just say, for example, you don't have a master's degree, you have a bachelor's degree. And so we're in this category 3 here, where you have a bachelor's degree, and then you have 2 years of full-time equivalent experience performing professional level analytical work as described in note A. So in many of these minimum qualifications descriptions, they are going to qualify the type of work experience that you've had. So you can't just have 2 years of any type of work experience. They want it to be applicable to this specific analyst job. And the way they'll define that is they'll point to a description of what they would see as professional level analytical work, and that's then described down here in note A. So note A in this specific 1822 example says you need 2 years of full-time equivalent working experience in one or more of the following areas, and then they list a whole menu of things. It could be complex budget analysis. It could be working with contract agreements. It could be economic analysis. It could be program evaluation and planning or legislative analysis. The key is it doesn't need to be all of these things. It just needs to be one of these things. So they cast a wide net as to what they consider applicable work experience. And in terms of the number of hours, 1 year is equivalent to 2,080 hours. So, usually if you're working a full-time job, like, many of the folks who might be working full-time now, you would take a standard year as equaling 2,080 hours. But let's just say, for example, you're about a year and a half in to your full-time job, but you graduated college only a year and a half ago, right? So you're like, well, I'm not quite there at 2 years. You could use your prior internship hours and experience over, the 3 months between your junior and senior year and the 3 months between your sophomore and junior year. And you could utilize that as a form of making up these 2,080 hours. Again, it would have to be under the qualifying work experience sort of categories, but it is something to consider. So don't completely write off your internship hours, just make sure that they're as described in accordance to this note as best it can be. Another option is kind of shifting to a different way of qualification. So I described earlier having a bachelor's degree and then having 2 years of experience in the following categories. Another way of qualifying, which you'll see in many postings, is the possession of a bachelor's degree with major coursework as described in Note B and 1 year full-time experience. So instead of having 2 years needed, this one specifically asks for only 1, but if and only if your bachelor's degree was in coursework that is listed under the note. So you had a bachelor's degree in business administration, management, public policy, urban studies, econ, and so forth. And so I will say these are one of the weird, this is one of the weird things that people kind of get tripped up on during the application process. Like, you know, what if you want to be an 1822 analyst, but you didn't major in political science or public policy? You majored in biology. That's not explicitly stated here. So my suggestion would be, even though your application says you have a BA in biology, through the application process, make it very clear that you took coursework in economics, you took coursework in finance or statistics, or urban studies, because a biology major might not be as applicable to, or as like obvious that you took that coursework. So you really have to be an advocate for yourself to say, even though I didn't major in this specific field, I took a lot of coursework in this field. And this is particularly for the bachelor's degrees that are not so obvious. So a lot of colleges will have something called like social studies or human biology or critical studies in race and ethnicity. And it's not very clear to an HR analyst who's looking at your application that really means you did take coursework in this area. And I say that because this is a really great way of qualifying for these positions, because you only need, in addition to having this bachelor's degree in these specific areas, you only need 1 year of full-time experience. So that bachelor's degree in that area acts as a proxy to help you substitute for work experience that you just might not have because you're just early in your career. And then a few notes I'll just say. Sometimes what happens through the process is the minimum qualifications requirement is typically the very first step into HR deciding whether or not you're a candidate that can move on in the process and a candidate that cannot. So the MQ review is often the very first step to filtering out candidates who will make it to the next phase and will not make it to the next phase. So it's very critical in my experience that you are as crystal clear with how you meet the minimum qualifications. And so often what happens is if for whatever reason the HR analyst who is in charge of this posting will say, sorry, you didn't meet the MQs, and that's why you didn't get a response back. You have the opportunity to write a letter or to respond with, I wouldn't call it a formal protest, but a response to say like, well, hey, let me justify how I do qualify. And so my note is, if you receive a response saying that you don't meet the minimum qualifications, I would suggest that you ask if there is a mechanism or a way that you can provide additional supplementary information, whether it's an email or a letter. And in that's where you really say, you know, even though I was a social science major, I took coursework in this area. Here's my documentation from my undergrad that shows that I did take these classes, and so on. And when all else fails, follow up with an HR analyst that's assigned to the job posting. Every job posting will have, obviously what it's for, but there will be an HR, human resources analyst that's assigned to it. And really it's their job to field these questions and to make sure that candidates are not, for whatever reason, prohibited from moving on to the next phase of the process, just because there was some confusion on this first review. So it might require a little bit of back and forth, but this is where you should really be an advocate for yourself, and talk to other folks who may have had this experience as well. I know folks who have initially been rejected from job post-job application processes because they didn't meet the MQs, and then they had a conversation, they read a letter, and then all of a sudden they were moved on to the next phase, and they actually got the job and were very happy and successful in that role. And so it would be unfortunate for this kind of weird, wonky system to reduce the amount of talent that can move forward.
And also following up on that, give yourself time to submit the application long before the deadline so that you have some opportunity to remedy things and follow up with the HR analyst if need be.
That's a great point, Michael, because again, give yourself time for the back and forth, because especially if you're new to the process, and you've never applied to a position that's an 1822 analyst, and you haven't really tested whether you meet the minimum qualifications just yet. Give yourself time so that you can have that conversation with HR and build your case, more or less. So once you get to that point, really, like, the whole goal is to get the interview, right? You're like, okay, I just need to get through this weird, wonky HR system, and once they can talk to me, but like life should be better. And the way you do that is, as I was mentioning earlier, when you're putting your application together, and I believe the San Francisco portal in its new version, as well as many other city portals, will have, basic information of who you are. Many have bonus points if you have a relative who works in San Francisco, who works for that local jurisdiction. There's going to be a lot of these questions, whether you're a veteran, for example. Those are called promotive points. That's to encourage folks who are from a diverse background to work for that jurisdiction, which is really great. But there will be another section where you're actually inputting your work experience. And so, for example, if I'm applying to that 1822 analyst position, they're going to ask me, well, what work have you done before? And so I'm going to list, well, I was an analyst at the city of Hayward, and I was there for 2 years. And so the goal when you're listing your work experience at those other places is to confirm that you meet the minimum number of qualifying years. And so what I mean when I say that is, there's dates, right? There's going to be like, well, from February 2020 to February 2021, I worked at this city. They're going to calculate the number of hours to make sure that that equals a year. So there's a number component to it. And then the second piece of it is they're going to ask, well, is this qualifying? And the best way that I can suggest that you make 100% sure that that's qualifying is when you're describing your role at that place, you're really sticking to the language that in the posting has been described as qualifying experience. And this might feel really weird because you're like, am I copy and pasting? Like, am I using the exact same wording? The way I see it is make it crystal clear, have the process be as easy as you can, so that there's no there's no gray area as to what you did in those previous roles. And maybe you built, for example, you built financial models for the financial planning team. I would say that is complex budget analysis and complex financial and fiscal analysis, right? I wouldn't say built financial models for quarterly projections, right? You could provide that color as well, but stick to the language as best you can, so that whoever is reviewing it on the human resources end can say, yep, this person worked at the city of Hayward. Yep, they did complex financial and budget analysis for that year. Crystal clear, done. That is a year of qualifying experience. Don't get too cute with how you describe what you did there. I can see that feels counterintuitive to trying to make your case, but it can further complicate the process. And so just be as explicit as you can. The same goes for your resume. So again, you probably all have resumes that are describes your past work experience in a particular way. It's great to have that resume saved and being able to share that with folks. But in terms of the resume that you actually attach to the application, again, try to be as explicit as you can on how those years specifically met the minimum qualifications as described. And that's so that you can pass through this first phase of an MQ check, because they're looking at number of years / hours and whether or not it was in that qualifying description. So this goes for prior work experience, it goes for internship years, it goes for partial years where you worked at maybe multiple places. And so just be very explicit about that, because you really want to make sure that they can add up 1 year of qualifying experience, or if needed, 2 or more years of qualifying experience. The next step, which often happens, is you could get either a supplemental questionnaire or a civil service exam. I would say typically most permanent positions, which in San Francisco we call permanent civil service positions, require what's called a civil service exam. And that's where HR in the posting will actually say you're required to come in person to take an exam, and you have to pass that exam with a certain score in order to qualify and go into the interview round. And I'm sure Michael can attest to this. I've taken many civil service exams for jobs that I didn't even necessarily want, nor was I super stoked or hyped about. And the reason why I did that is one exam can be applicable to many job openings. So you might take one exam that's tied to an analyst position at the MTA, but you really want to work for the Department of Homeless, HSH, or I think it's Homeless Housing and Supportive Services. But they're both 1822 positions. One department can always borrow exam lists from other postings. So just because you're applying to one position and you're taking one exam doesn't mean that it's always going to be applicable to that exam or to that specific posting. And furthermore, your scores can qualify. So you can apply for a job that maybe you're not super stoked about. You can take the exam, you could pass it, and you could decide, maybe I don't want to interview, or maybe you don't get that position. You can apply that score to future job postings, so you don't have to keep taking tests over and over again. And scores also, and tests also are very hard to come by. So that's also another thing, is you might get a job, you might see a job posting that you really like, but for whatever reason, they're not going to host an exam. They're only going to look at existing applicants that are already on exam lists. That automatically means that you're not going to be able to get the job because you've never taken the exam before, and they're not opening an exam. So there's been cases where they've only hosted an 1822 exam for one time over like an 18-month period. So everybody else was just locked out. And people do that, departments do that for timing reasons, you know, to expedite the process. But it's really unfortunate for folks who just didn't get an opportunity to take the exam. So if you see an exam opening, take it. It's almost always the same exam, based off of the classification number, regardless of which department it's for. So it's more or less going to be the same exam regardless of the department. And then what's also really helpful is, I didn't quite know this, but one exam can actually qualify you for multiple classifications. So let's just say you're taking an 1820 exam, but you score really high, that can qualify you for an 1822 position. It can potentially qualify you to an 1823 position based off of your score. So later down the road, if you want to apply for an 1823 position, you already have an exam score that qualifies for that. So it's just kind of like covers the bases, and helps you be more flexible as you're looking at job opportunities going forward. The next is supplemental questionnaires. So sometimes the job applications will ask you to kind of respond to questions, to make sure that you can give like case study examples of your qualifying experience. Again, provide those. They should connect to your past work experience, but make sure that they fall under the categories and the minimum qualifications. Again, I keep saying that over and over again, but it's very important. And then through the interview process, they're really looking at how well a candidate qualifies for the role. So they might be asking you the same questions kind of than what you've already provided in the written response. But again, it's to check the boxes to make sure that you're definitely ready for the position, you meet the MQs. And then furthermore, often jobs are to confirm fit, right? So there'll be your standard interview questions around your work style and your work experience. It's really important to answer these questions, again, as explicitly as you can, to tie them to your work qualifications, and to meet the minimum qualifications. And they're not necessarily based off of your, like, how well you interview. So this is a weird thing. If a lot of people who've never interviewed for civil service positions are like, weird, like that person wasn't even really nodding. They weren't asking me any follow-up questions. It felt very cold. And there's a reason why that is. And it's because there's a specific rubric of points that are applied based off of what you say. And this is some interviews will kind of vary, but the standard civil service interview is very much like this. And so they're looking for you to say complex budget analysis. They're looking for you to say that you worked with Excel. They're looking for specific language that they can say that person gave me a very clear and detailed example of how they meet, how they're qualified for this position, versus something that might be a little bit more generic and might sound good in an interview. It's not something that they can base a score off of. So just be mindful of that. And follow-up questions are not always allowed. So make sure you utilize your time as best you can. Say as much as you can during that time period. And then lastly, if a position is exempt, meaning it's not a permanent position, but it's exempt to certain civil service processes, the interview process might not be as stringent. It might be a little bit more open and casual. And so that's just something when you're looking at how positions are described, what to expect in the interview process. I know we're about at 6:45-ish, so I'm going to try to go through quickly the next couple of slides and then leave some questions for time for questions. A big question is, how has COVID impacted this whole process and the ability to have, or the job opportunities that are out there? It's changing as we go, and as each budget cycle changes. There may be more good news about revenue and more good news about further future job opportunities. But from what we gathered in the last year or two, or really over the last 18 months, is that a lot of departments are going to be in the position where it's very difficult to justify not only their current positions. So a lot of people were being asked to cut back on their operating budget, which makes it almost impossible for them to create newer positions, right? Because that's an additional budget ask. So that just means there's fewer opportunities. And so that's all the more reason why you should be looking often, and when you see postings, jump on them right away, because it's never a sure thing that there's going to be a steady flow of new positions or openings with San Francisco or with any city or county. One caveat I will say is a lot of the positions that are mostly impacted are general funded, meaning they're funded from the city or the jurisdiction's general fund that's typically at the mayor, the board of supervisor, or the city council's discretion on how they want to spend it. That's the more constrained budget. When you look at other departments and openings that are revenue generating, meaning they create their own revenue, a lot of utility districts are like this. A lot of departments that don't rely on the mayor's budget process, but really on like how many, how much water is being sold, the airport, for example, how much revenue is being generated from their fees. Those are less so tied to the whims of the general fund, and so might have more opportunities for openings and positions there. And then, stepping outside of the San Francisco application process, what are other things to be mindful of? In any city or local jurisdiction, the civil service process will almost always guide the application process. So, as one of the great things about working for a local government, applying for local government jobs, is that they really set the standards for not giving jobs through like nepotism or word of mouth or friends and stuff like that. And so there's a very strict approach to how candidates are evaluated. What that's lent itself to is a very kind of somewhat convoluted process. And so approach the application process and the interview process with that in mind, is that they're really trying to be blind to who the person is, who they know, all those things, how fancy they might come off, to really look at what this person has accomplished and whether they're qualified. And I think that's a great thing. Other, I think, somewhat obvious tips, but really make a good impression, is to always proofread your applications and your cover letters. You'll be very surprised by how many applications I've read and how many panels I've sat on where people were being kind of really lazy about this approach, and it shows. And so, try to be, as refined as you can, and make sure you don't have any typos. Please don't use things like see resume for more details. That there are a lot of applications that, if you're trying to cut corners, will just throw that out, because they really need to see that you're putting in the qualifications for each job that you've listed as work experience, versus saying, look at my resume. It's not gonna, that's not applicable, I think, to the review of HR, and it just won't move forward. And then for supplemental questions, as I mentioned, make sure that your responses include specific examples and measurable deliverables. So don't be really generic. You need to be as specific and as explicit as you can. And often those supplemental questions can weight an applicant's application based off of how hard a person tried for those questions, and whether they were kind of being lazy with their approach. Michael, do you have anything to add before we shift?
That covers it.
Great. Here's some more job resources for things. San Francisco obviously has its own Department of Human Resources website. but there's websites for CalOps, government jobs, public service careers, Cal careers. There is really great networking. I should say professional networks, like the Municipal Managers Association of Northern California, or MMANC, the International City and County Management Association, or ICMA, GovLoop. A lot of these organizations have portals where you can go and see openings for local city and local jurisdiction jobs. And so please reach out to those folks. And it's always great to work your network and grab coffee with folks. Often, like, you'll find out that jobs are in the pipeline before they're officially posted, through just conversation and word of mouth. The next couple slides, I think, Michael, did you want to go over? This is really about, like, oh, well, what if I want to pause and go to grad school? Or what if I want to consider another route, but I really love local government? So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so, as you're considering what options will help you further your career, one question that may come up is whether going to grad school is the right decision for you. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's going to depend on where you are in your career currently, what your short and long-term goals are, what your financial situation and outlook are, etc. But that being said, one way to help you narrow down what's the right choice is to really reflect and think medium and long term what you want to be doing with your career, and then sketch out a viable pathway to get there. So some resources that can help you do that is taking a look at positions posted on the job websites that maybe you don't currently meet the minimum qualifications now, but you can be mindful of what those are and what you need to do to bolster your resume a bit more, so that in a few years you will meet the minimum qualifications. And also talking to people currently in roles that you want and understanding their journey, and seeing whether grad school is the right option. They can also give you tips on if they attended programs that you are interested in, what were the pros and cons to that. So in favor of going to grad school, you might find, for example, that you want to pivot from one field to another, but don't have the subject matter experience. So a 2-year grad school program might give you some time to really explore a subject, possibly do an internship, so that by the time you finish, you have a better wealth of knowledge and you'll be a more competitive applicant. But on the other hand, you might find yourself already on a career track or job classification track and find, hey, I'm already getting all of the learning and breadth of experience that I need to get to where I want to be. So in that case, it might not make sense for you to go to grad school, and you can avoid the opportunity cost and the financial cost of being in school for that long. At the bottom of this slide are some different grad programs. I mean, local government jobs run the gauntlet. So it really depends on what your interests are and how you want to approach it. So I recommend thinking broadly about what your interests are. And as I mentioned, taking a really deep dive and narrowing it down from there. So next slide. And again, on the subject of thinking broadly, even if you choose not to work in local government, there are so many opportunities that can help you make a similar impact, even in other sectors, because our job industry is very interconnected. So for some local government jobs, it might be beneficial to actually have some private sector experience beforehand, particularly if you're going to be working with businesses in the local community as part of your role. I've seen an example of that with some of my colleagues. But also if you do choose to go the private sector route, many companies like consulting agencies, contractors, they work very closely with government, and you can still be working on projects in your role at these companies that are geared towards the public good. And even if you have a private sector job that has nothing to do with government, there's still ways to get involved through nonprofit boards, professional organizations, etc. And in the nonprofit space, if you're looking for opportunities that are mission oriented and geared toward the public good, there are many roles that might fit for you. And like the private sector, many nonprofits work closely with government, and you can still be involved in municipal issues that you are passionate about. And finally, as Jamie mentioned, be on the lookout for jobs down the road. Definitely sign up on the websites to get automated notifications when roles and specific classifications are posted. Just because something isn't available now doesn't mean that down the road it won't come up later. So definitely keep your eyes out, because I'm sure our local governments would love to have bright people like yourselves working to make our communities better. So with that, we will shift into questions and answers, but we'll make one more plug for our other events opportunities. We are starting a new City Hall Fellows Flash mentoring. So please check out the link there to get part of that. And also we run a mentorship program. It's a 6-month-long program where we batch you with seasoned professionals in local government to help guide you in your career. So we'll be sending out information about how to sign up about that later. And finally, we have one event about interviewing with the city that we have planned, but we'll probably postpone that to a later date. Is that done? Okay.
Actually,
great.
this one is, sorry, Michael, this one is actually hosted by the city's HR program. So this is, I
Ah.
think it's only applicable to San Francisco city employees, but for the folks who are on the call that work with San Francisco, through your HR division, you should be able to, or you can just directly go to this Eventbrite. There should be spaces available. So if you follow questions on like what the heck interview process is like, they're hosting one on December 2nd. So keep a lookout. Yeah, and we'll go to Q&A. Any burning questions?
Hi, I'm Melissa. So I'm a very recent college graduate. And I think just one of the things that I really want to ask is about those requirements, specifically the course requirements, and like how we go about explaining that, because I did spend maybe like two years of my degree trying to pursue a business degree, and like how I would apply certain courses to make myself applicable to like a certain posting. Like, where would I explain that this is like I qualify?
My suggestion, so if it's not obvious in your bachelor's degree, or say you like shifted to a new major, I would try to make this that you explicit that you took those courses in your resume. Like there might just be a line that you put down at the bottom. This is like coursework, or when you list your undergrad or education experience. And then there will inevitably, if there's confusion, there will inevitably some questions will come up from HR. And so if you do get the like email back that say, oh, like you didn't meet the minimum qualifications because you didn't have a bachelor's degree in business, that's where you would write the letter and you would say, actually, I took 2 years of business courses, and you could provide your why am I forgetting the word where it shows your coursework, your transcript, exactly.
Yeah, would you just highlight that off?
Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Right.
I have one.
Go ahead, go for it.
I'm sorry. About that test. What does it look like? The civil service.
It's a good question. I don't think I'm allowed to tell you exactly what it is. But to give you a generic sense of what it is, it's typically an exam that covers a whole bunch of different things. Because if you think about it, and if it's an exam that's that's for many different roles. They can't be too specific in each subject matter area, right? So it's not going to be too finance heavy, and it's not going to be too like grammar or language heavy. It's going to be a good diversity of all those types of questions. And like think like SAT like, but not as aggressive. I don't know how to describe it. But it is like a similar exam that's like that. Yeah. And in terms of the format of the exam processes, you know, they always want to make sure that they're not setting up a circumstance in which people like don't have enough time or feel like they're too constrained in terms of taking an exam. So in my experience, there's always been more than enough time allotted to take a civil service exam for folks like me who like hate standardized testing and just don't love the format of it. There's a lot of thought process around making sure that doesn't become a prohibitive issue when you're taking these types of exams.
Thank you.
Sure. So I will say, yeah, we just want to say thank you all for joining. Oh, did I go back to my presentation? I don't know if you guys can still see it. Thank you all for joining. Please visit our website at cityhallfellows.org, sign up for our email list, find us on Facebook and LinkedIn to keep in the know on events like this in the future. We'll put out a survey for this webinar to see how helpful it was and just provide feedback from folks who attended. But feel free to email us at info@cityhallfellows.org if you have any questions and related to this webinar or related to the program in general. So yeah, and I think thanks, Michael. You posted information about the exam in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that as well. But appreciate you guys taking your time out of your Thursday evenings to join us. And hope you have a great evening and happy Thanksgiving. Early Thanksgiving.
Thank you.